I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Casey Chapter, and I'm an undergraduate student at Florida State University. I'm also an editor and reporter for the FS View and Florida Flambeau, FSU's independent student-run newspaper. Ever since high school, I wanted to pursue journalism as a career, but the more I learned about the state of the industry, the more intrigued I became about how difficult it can be to thrive as a journalist.
The economic foundation of newspapers has collapsed.
Local newspapers print fewer pages less frequently, and in some cases collapse entirely.
Local papers only make up 25% of the country's media outlets, but they produce almost half of all original reporting.
But the thing is that a democracy dies without a free press.
Without the local news, it'll be very hard for us to keep people accountable.
So the million-dollar question for at least the last decade, probably longer, has been how do we fund healthy journalism?
I decided to create this documentary to find out all I can about the state of print media, specifically newspapers. I started my journey of reporting for this documentary with Kristen Hare. She's an editor and a reporter at the Poynter Institute, which produces coverage of the journalism industry. She's essentially a reporter who reports on reporting. So I went to St. Petersburg, Florida to meet with her. So we are on the way to meet with Kristen Hare at the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. She's a reporter and an editor, and she's done a lot of reporting on the media industry, so I'm excited to talk to her about that kind of stuff. And that's what it will look like. And all we need is the person. Thank you. Would you mind introducing yourself and telling me what your title is and what you do?
I'm Kristen Hare, and I am a faculty member here at the Poynter Institute, and I teach and cover local news. So for the last 8 years, I have been a reporter here at Poynter covering local news, the transformation of local news in a digital era, and writing about the people who work in local news and people who care about local news. About 2 weeks ago, I switched over to our faculty, and now I'm teaching what local journalists need to know best for the times that we're in right now.
So lately, a big message that's been coming through has been support your local newsroom. So what exactly does that translate to?
That's a great question. You know, your local newsroom can be a lot of things. It can be a public radio station, it can be a newspaper, it can be an online site, it can be a nonprofit site, it can be an alt weekly, it could be a local public access television show. Local news takes a lot of forms, which I think is really exciting. Just like that, supporting local news takes lots of forms. I think that message means the same thing it means to everyone else, which is, we can't do this work without your support. I think what it means to the journalists in the room is the same. We live here, we cover this place, we are your local newsroom. I think what it means to the community, though, is different, and that is you are our local newsroom, and you're owned by a corporation. You don't have a base here. Your bosses don't live here. They don't have kids in our school districts. They're not affected by whatever the local government changes are when they come through the pipeline. And that is where the disconnect happens. And unfortunately, that is the most critical juncture for that message to matter. So local journalists and corporate newsrooms still live there. They are local, but there's a disconnect, and that's between the corporation and the audience itself.
Thank you. I'm glad you went into that, because my next questions were, what does it mean to readers? What does it mean to the newsrooms themselves?
The biggest challenge for communities, and I think this is such a reflection of how Americans think, is like we want things to be local. We like local, but we don't always support it, right? And we especially don't always support it before it's gone. But it's real easy for us to look at something that we don't like and be like, oh, it's corporate. that has almost an implication that nobody even has to explain. And it is true also of journalism. There are decisions that are made about what's happening in every small newsroom that have nothing to do with that small newsroom or the people who live and work there. And that, I think, is dangerous. A lot of newsrooms that have been successful during the pandemic are successful because they're local and independently owned, and they aren't fighting against a corporate power structure or agenda or corporate goals that may or may not fit that specific community.
In order to hear from the corporate side of things, I decided to reach out to the executive editor of the local newspaper, the Tallahassee Democrat. He declined my request for an interview. Something I should mention is that a lot of local newspapers might not exist if not for corporations like Gannett buying them, giving them the funds and resources to continue producing journalism. The same could be said for the FSView, which I currently work for. I also reached out to Gannett Media Corporation directly. When I initially asked for an interview with CEO Mike Reed, Heather Gadali with Corporate Communications got back to me and said she'd be happy to schedule one if I would send over a list of questions. But this interview never happened. Once I sent my questions, the head of Corporate Communications, Lark Marie Anton, sent me back a list of short written responses and some links. One of my questions asked about the number of layoffs at Gannett since their merger with Gatehouse in 2019. To this question, her response was, quote, "not applicable." She said they'd be willing to do a written interview via email. I reached out once again asking for a live interview, and this was their response. Hi Casey, thank you for considering Mike Reed and Gannett for your documentary. Unfortunately, at this time, we are unable to accommodate an interview and will be in contact should that change. While all of this was going on, I was coordinating another interview with a journalist who has decades of experience in the industry.
My name is Moni Basu. I've been a reporter and editor for almost 40 years. I started working at the Florida Flambeau and fell in love with journalism and never looked back, and became editor of that paper. Then worked at the Democrat briefly, and then in 1990 I got a job at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where I worked for almost 20 years, and then worked for almost 10 years at CNN.
My name is Moni Basu. I'm a journalist for CNN.
And now I teach journalism. My students are interested in print, they're writers. I'm realistic with them. They all know that newspapers are in trouble. And so most of them are very savvy. I tell them that you need to have multiple skills. You can't just be a writer anymore. You need to be able to take photographs. You need to be able to do other things. I thought I would retire as a newspaper reporter. And then in the 2000s, it became obvious to me that the newspaper was shrinking, the budget was shrinking. The big blow to newspapers came when Craigslist went up, because a huge amount of revenue came from classified advertising. That was greatly diminished with Craigslist, and then eventually, of course, the internet. Newspapers lost a great deal, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution today is a shadow of its former self. We, at one time, had a staff of almost 600 people, and now it's down to about 100 people. And even here in Tallahassee, the Democrat is just a sliver of the paper that I once worked for. I just keep waiting for someone to come up with a new business model that's going to really be profitable for newspapers. And so far, it really hasn't happened.
There's a great deal of churn in the industry. When you get a subscriber, you have to work really hard to keep them. And so offering content that only they can read, is one way to serve those needs. At the same time, I saw a lot of newsrooms open up, especially early in the pandemic, their COVID coverage and offer it completely for free, showing their communities that, like, this is a disaster, this is an emergency, we will give this to you the same way we would if there was a hurricane or a tornado or a flood. There are newsrooms that didn't do that. Hearst newsrooms did not offer anything up for free and found that it didn't affect their subscriber numbers. They were still having people subscribe because they felt like that was valuable. So I think all of that gets to a key philosophical challenge that we have right now in journalism, which is, are we here to serve the public good, or are we here to stay in business? And both things can certainly be true, but which of those things are you thinking about during a crisis? And we've seen lots of newsrooms treat that differently, including by making some content specifically premium just for subscribers.
Next, I wanted to hear from a local teenager with strong journalistic impulses. He helped create a documentary about a local issue he found important: youth poverty.
My name is Ananda Chatterjee, and I'm a senior at Rickards High School in Tallahassee, Florida. What inspired the project was an op-ed I read in the Tallahassee Democrat, which talked about how youth poverty was a crisis in the community, specifically in the 32304 zip code. Reading that op-ed inspired me to take some action and maybe continue to raise awareness, because I realized that if this is something that I didn't know much about, then there were also many others in the community that could benefit knowing about it. So I realized that a documentary could be a good way of sharing the story of many of the people in the zip code.
It all comes down to one thing: access to opportunity. Youth in the South Side face greater crime rates, less funded schools, and an abundance of malnourishment due to food deserts.
Gen Z Media is a group of high school students seeking to create awareness about community challenges and current events. We knew that we wanted to produce documentaries and maybe podcasts, but there was no clear mission statement like we have now. As we started producing more content, we realized that there was a theme to it that was related to current events, that it was something that we believed impacted young people, and that it was something we thought could be shared through a visual format. So at first glance, I believe what the news gives us is just information. But I think what makes the news so important is that it provides information that results in us feeling certain emotions. And those emotions can result in us acting. And this could be in a way that through democratic processes, such as voting. So I think that's what the news provides us. It provides us cause, it provides us the information to feel strongly or to feel about a certain event or certain thing. And I think that's very important. Oh, this is just what we were talking about right now, about how Governor DeSantis was removing Congressman Lawson's district. As people, we have opinions on the things that happen in the world around us, and the news is one of the primary places that facilitate us developing those opinions. Platforms like TikTok and other social media outlets are used very commonly as a platform of news for people in my generation. And I think the reason for that is because of its convenience. Sometimes reading things like newspaper articles can be a little bit more boring. And I think a lot of people prefer the fast-paced format of news. And obviously this can result in some of the main ideas getting lost, but at the same time, it can serve as a useful and convenient way of getting information.
Another major issue I wanted to address in this documentary is the public's distrust of the media.
The media in general is under fire in America. I mean, our former president called us the enemies of the people. We have this term now called fake news.
Fake news has morphed into the phrase enemy of the people.
I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are.
What we saw that we've never seen before at such a high level is journalists who, live in their communities, are covering their communities. There would be in person, but even more online, just a lot of vitriol aimed at them. There were many points during the 4 years of the Trump administration where I think a lot of journalists questioned if it was worth it to do what they were doing and to be putting themselves in harm's way, sometimes to be, physically harmed, other times to have them and their families threatened.
I think we are seeing a time now where there is a great amount of distrust in the media. There's all sorts of reasons for it. One of them is the internet and the proliferation of information on the internet, not all of which is accurate or true. I think the biggest contributor to distrust of the media has been social media, and people just like to follow people that they agree with, and they don't always get fair and balanced accountings of what is happening in the world. We need to, as journalists, work harder to win back that trust. I don't believe in objectivity because that word is kind of silly when you apply it to human beings. As human beings, we are by definition, by virtue, subjective. What I tell my students is you must go out of your way to make sure that every story is fair and that you're not unfairly taking somebody down in your stories. That's how people lose trust in you.
Is there mutual responsibility with bridging the divide between citizens and journalists? Do you think that citizens should also make an effort to become media literate?
Do I think citizens have a responsibility to become media literate? Absolutely, yes. If you expect us to provide the news in a fair and balanced way, then we expect you to consume the news in a fair and balanced way, and also to understand more about journalists. We are not evil enemies of the people. Journalists often put themselves in danger. They often work 7 days in a row without a break. They often leave their own families behind to bring you the stories of the world. So have some respect for that also. I think that the general citizenry often forgets that, or maybe they don't even know it.
I think in general, unless you're somebody who is really plugged into, journalism and you have some favorite news sources, you probably have no idea what newsrooms are going through. I think that changed during the pandemic a little bit because the New York Times, for instance, can tell me all kinds of amazing things to make my life more interesting and better and make me a more informed citizen, but they couldn't tell me how many COVID infections there were, like in my zip code. And the Tampa Bay Times, which I subscribe to, they could. And so I think that local journalism in particular, but all journalism, did show its value during the pandemic. I think there are more people who are now aware what journalism is up against, but I still think it's very easy to be completely unaware of all of it. There has been a recognition that we have to think differently about how we fund journalism. And there are lots of different models. A subscriber model is one, and a nonprofit or a for-profit model, and then harnessing philanthropy has been one that works for both for-profit and nonprofit newsrooms. What that means is finding organizations in your community that have resources and are willing to support journalism. And this isn't too big of a stretch. The challenge for newsrooms is to create a firewall, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, so that the people who are funding know that they will have no influence over the journalism. And then you have to be very clear on your website how that's set up, how much they've given, how it's spent, and what that firewall looks like. So I think assuring the public that this is independent journalism is important.
I believe what motivates me to keep working on Gen Z media is that it's fueled a lot by issues that resonate with people my age, and there's no shortage of things that are out there. So as long as there's content and as long as there's information that resonates with people my age, there will always be room to build upon that and create projects that can perhaps create more awareness about those things. And I think Generation Z Media is the platform that allows me to do that.
Here are my key takeaways. Newspapers are evolving to meet the needs of their communities. One way is by going digital. Since social media and video news dominate the market, newspapers are adapting by expanding their online presence. This brings uniformity to the industry, but also creates a disconnect between local communities and the corporations running their local newspapers. The news is civic involvement. Whether you're producing the news or reading it, you're engaging with your community. You're caring about the people around you and what's happening to them. And you're staying informed, whether it's a story about corruption in your local city hall or about an animal shelter rescuing a pot-bellied pig from a fraternity house.
We're not out of any of the woods yet. We're not out of the pandemic woods. We're not out of, the struggles of newsrooms to find funding and build audiences and to be seen as legitimate by, about half of the population of the country. Those are still three really big challenges. And the, important work that journalists have to do of covering our communities and telling the stories of who we are and why we do what we do, those things have to happen in tandem. We can't just expect that people will see why we're valuable. We have to remind them of, I think, the place that we hold in our communities and in healthy democracies.
I hope that in the future, local newspapers are able to provide information to larger audiences, particularly young people, as I think the opinions we formulate at an early age can often stay with us for a very long time.
My whole life's mission now has been to inspire a new generation of journalists so that good news reporting will carry on. It's very important. It's critical. It's vital. It's absolutely vital.